It had been a long, exhausting day. Meetings, handshakes, policy debates, hours spent under the bright lights of expectation. J.D. Vance wasn't thinking about politics anymore. He wasn't thinking about the speeches, the headlines, or the pressure that came with his position. Right now, he just wanted a meal. His car rolled into the parking lot of a small diner, one of those places that had been around forever. The neon sign flickered against the night, the hum of electricity barely noticeable over the occasional passing car. Through the glass windows, he could see the warm glow of the lights inside, the silhouettes of people talking, eating, living their lives. The kind of place that didn't change much. Where the regulars had their usual booths, where the smell of fresh coffee mixed with grilled burgers, where the waitress probably knew everyone's order before they even sat down. For a moment, J.D. exhaled, feeling a strange sense of comfort. He wasn't a politician right now, just a man looking for a meal before a long drive home. He pulled the door open, and the small bell above jingled. Heads turned, just for a second. A brief glance, a moment of recognition before people returned to their conversations. The sound of clinking plates, soft murmurs of casual talk, the faint sizzle of the grill in the back. Everything seemed normal. At least that's what he thought, because in the next few minutes, J.D. Vance was about to realize that this wasn't just any meal. This night would be different. This night would change everything. Have you ever walked into a place and felt, before anyone even spoke, that you weren't welcome? What did you do? Did you leave? Or did you stay and see what would happen next? J.D. stepped inside, the warm air of the diner wrapping around him, carrying the familiar scent of brewed coffee and sizzling burgers. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The soft chatter of regulars, the distant clatter of silverware, the hum of a place that had seen decades of life. It was the kind of place where time moved a little slower, where faces were familiar, where things rarely changed. But then, something did change. He caught the eye of the hostess behind the counter. She had started to smile, just for a second, before her expression shifted. A flicker of hesitation. Something small, almost unnoticeable, but J.D. noticed. The way her lips pressed together. The quick glance over her shoulder, as if checking with someone in the back. The way the conversations around him didn't exactly stop, but they slowed. A man, halfway through his burger, leaned in and whispered something to the person across from him. A woman in a flannel shirt set her coffee cup down harder than necessary. It was a feeling J.D. had experienced before. That quiet shift in the air. Like walking into a room where you weren't expected. Or maybe where you weren't wanted. Still, he stayed. The hostess took a breath, then spoke, her voice careful. Good evening. Are you dining in or taking out?" J.D. smiled lightly. "Dining in, if that's all right." Another hesitation. Too long for such a simple question. Then she excused herself. "One moment, I just need to check something." She disappeared through the swinging door. And now, J.D. was left standing there. The air in the room changed again. A few more heads turned in his direction. A man at the counter shifted in his seat. Someone muttered something under their breath. Something wasn't right. Behind the kitchen doors, muffled voices rose and fell. The kind of hushed conversation that didn't need words to be understood. J.D. exhaled slowly. He wasn't going to assume anything. Not yet. Maybe they were short-staffed. Maybe there was some policy he didn't know about. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, he knew better. Something was about to happen. Have you ever felt a shift in a room before anything was even said? Like an unspoken energy, a quiet message telling you that something was off. What did you do? Did you ignore it? Or did you prepare yourself for what was coming next? The door to the back swung open. The hostess was different now. Before, there had been hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty, of indecision. But now, her posture was straight, her face set. Whatever doubts she might have had were gone. She wasn't hesitating anymore. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice firmer now. "We can't serve you tonight." Just like that. No explanation, no excuse. The words landed heavily in the space between them, thick and unmoving. JD stood there, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to feel the weight of it. The diner had gone quieter now. Not silent. The sizzle of the grill in the back still crackled. A fork scraped against a plate somewhere. But the usual hum of conversation had dulled. People were listening, watching. JD took a breath. He had options. He could laugh it off and leave. He could demand an explanation. He could challenge them, make them say it out loud, make them explain themselves in front of a room full of people. But instead, he asked one simple question. "I'm sorry. Did I do something wrong?" The hostess didn't fidget this time. She didn't glance back toward the kitchen for help. She had already decided. "It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight. No policy. No, we're closing soon." Just that. JD felt the weight of a dozen unsaid things in those words. This wasn't about business. This was personal. He exhaled through his nose, setting his hands on his hips. He'd been in uncomfortable situations before. Political debates designed to trip him up, interviews meant to push him into a corner. But this was different. This wasn't about a political stance. This wasn't about policy. This was about who he was. And yet, he wasn't angry. Instead, he glanced around, noticing the way the room was reacting. The older man near the counter, the one who looked like he had been coming here for years, shook his head, more to himself than anyone else, before stabbing at his eggs again. A few booths over, a woman shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger guy, maybe in his 30s, leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Like he was enjoying the show. JD took it all in, the eyes that turned away the second they met his, the ones that lingered too long, the ones that held something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. This wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented, what he stood for, what people thought he stood for. He could feel the weight of it pressing on him. And now, he had a choice. Did he walk out, shake his head, let it go, drive away, and never think about this place again? Or did he stay? Instead, he did something no one expected. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. His voice was even, measured, calm. "Can I speak with the manager?" The room shifted again. The young guy in the corner let out a sharp laugh, like he couldn't believe JD was actually going through with this. The hostess hesitated again, just for a second this time. She glanced toward the kitchen as if asking for silent permission. JD waited, and then, without another word, she disappeared through another door. Now the real conversation was about to begin. What would you do if you were in his position? Would you walk away? Would you demand answers? Or would you stay, risking further rejection, just to understand why? Have you ever been in a moment where you had to decide between pride and patience? Between standing your ground and simply letting go? The door had barely closed behind the hostess, but the moment had already changed. The air in the diner wasn't just quiet anymore. It was charged. JD could feel it. That weight in the room, that almost invisible shift when something unexpected happens, and people aren't sure what to do with it. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding anything. He had simply asked to speak to the manager. And yet, that one sentence had shifted the entire mood. A man sitting at the counter exhaled slowly, stirring his coffee like he suddenly found it fascinating. A woman in the corner, arms crossed, tapped her foot against the floor, her eyes flickering between JD and the kitchen door. A younger guy, mid-30s, rugged-looking, dressed like he worked with his hands, leaned back in his booth, a smirk stretching across his face. He was enjoying this, like this was the kind of drama he'd been hoping for when he walked in. "Man," he muttered just loud enough to be heard, shaking his head. "This is gonna be good." JD didn't react. Not to him, not to any of them. Instead, he glanced over at the older man sitting near the counter. Rough hands, a blue work jacket, frayed at the cuffs. The kind of man who had been coming to this diner for decades, whose presence here was almost part of the furniture. He wasn't looking at JD, but his fork had been hovering over his plate for a little too long. Like he was thinking. Like he was listening. And that's when JD realized something. This moment wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about one decision. It was about what it meant. What it said about the town. About the country. It was about who people thought he was. And who they had already decided he would be before he even opened his mouth. Because that's how it works, isn't it? People make up their minds before they ever really listen. Before they ever really see. JD let out a slow breath, setting his hands in his pockets. No tension, no aggression. He was just standing there. Waiting. And yet, somehow, that made people even more uncomfortable. The young guy in the booth let out a chuckle, shaking his head. He wanted JD to react. He wanted a fight. He wanted confirmation that his opinion of JD was right. And that's what this was about, wasn't it? Confirmation. It wasn't about who JD actually was. It was about who they needed him to be. The kitchen door swung open. The manager stepped out. A man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. The kind of guy who had spent a lifetime running this place, keeping it together. His name tag read, Don. Don didn't ask JD what he wanted, didn't welcome him, didn't introduce himself. He just looked JD over once, his jaw tight, and said, "I hear you got a question." And the way he said it, it wasn't welcoming. It wasn't even polite. It was a challenge. JD met his stare. Steady. Unreadable. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to throw his weight around. But he also wasn't about to just walk out without understanding why. "Yeah," JD said simply. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." The diner was dead silent now. Even the young guy in the booth, the one who had been waiting for a fight, stopped smirking. Because now it was real. Now there was nowhere to hide. Have you ever been judged before you even got a chance to speak? Ever walked into a room where people already decided what kind of person you were? And in that moment, did you fight back? Or did you do something they never expected? What do you think JD should do next? And more importantly, what would you do? The weight in the room was impossible to ignore now. Don stood there, arms still crossed over his chest, watching JD carefully. Waiting. He had probably expected JD to walk out. Maybe even argue, make a scene, give everyone in the diner exactly what they were waiting for. But instead, JD just nodded slowly. His voice was calm, measured, even. "All right," he said. "Then let's talk." For a second, the whole diner seemed to freeze. Even Don blinked, just once, just enough for JD to know he had caught him off guard. He hadn't expected that. The young guy in the booth let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Oh man, this guy's got nerve." JD ignored him. His focus was on Don now, because this wasn't just about him. It wasn't even just about this diner. It was about something bigger. JD knew exactly what was happening here. He'd seen it before. He'd felt it before. This wasn't just about one decision. It was about the pressure behind it, the expectation, the people watching, the weight of a town that had already made up its mind. And Don? Maybe he had made up his mind too. Or maybe he was just doing what he thought he had to do. Don exhaled sharply through his nose. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing toward the handful of customers still watching the exchange. Some were pretending not to listen. Others weren't even bothering to hide their curiosity. "Talk," Don repeated, almost like he was testing the word, like he wasn't sure if it belonged here. JD just shrugged. "You don't want me here, I get that. What I don't get is why. So let's talk about it." The silence in the diner shifted. It wasn't the same heavy, waiting silence from before. It was something else now. something closer to uncertainty. Because that's what happens when someone doesn't react the way you expect them to. It throws people off. It makes them rethink things, even if just for a second, and JD could see it happening now. Don's fingers curled slightly against his apron. Not a full reaction, not an obvious tell, but enough. Enough for JD to know he wasn't as sure about this as he wanted to seem. But before Don could answer, the younger guy in the booth let out a scoff. "Oh, come on," he muttered, rolling his eyes. He shook his head, leaning forward now, resting his arms on the table like he had been waiting for this moment. "This ain't that deep," he said. "You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." JD turned toward him now, studying him. This guy, he wasn't just reacting to what was happening in the diner. He was enjoying it. He wanted a fight. He wanted JD to argue, because that's how these things go, right? Someone says something, someone else pushes back, and then suddenly it's us versus them. Simple, predictable. But JD didn't give him that. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and asked, "And who am I?" The guy smirked. "You're the guy who acts like he understands regular people, but you play politics like everyone else." JD nodded slowly, considering that. "All right," he said. "Then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" And just like that, the young guy's smirk faded, because that wasn't the response he was expecting. He expected JD to argue, to defend himself, to push back. But instead, JD had flipped it. He wasn't fighting. He was listening, giving the guy exactly what he wanted, the chance to say what was on his mind. And now? Now the guy didn't know what to do with it. Across the room, Don exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "This ain't what I expected tonight," he muttered. JD cracked a small, tired smile. "Me neither." But for the first time, the tension in the room wasn't just about division. It was about something else, something closer to understanding. People were still listening, even those who had stayed quiet, even those who had already made up their minds. Because that's the thing about conversation. It makes people rethink things, even when they don't want to. What happens when someone you disagree with actually listens to you? Does it change anything? Or does it just make it harder to hold on to anger? Have you ever been in a conversation where, for a moment, you actually saw things from the other side? Did it make you rethink what you believed? Or did you double down? And why? The air in the diner had changed. It wasn't hostility anymore. Not exactly. It was something closer to curiosity. JD could feel it. The young guy in the booth, the one who had been so eager to throw punches with his words, was hesitating now. Not because he agreed with JD, not because he had changed his mind, but because this wasn't going the way he expected. JD hadn't fought back, hadn't thrown insults, hadn't stormed out. He had stayed, and he had listened. And now? Now the young guy wasn't so sure what to do next. Don let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't smiling, wasn't giving in. But there was something different in his face now, something less certain. He glanced toward the counter, toward the old man in the frayed work jacket. The man was still there, still eating his meal, but he hadn't lifted his fork in a while. He was listening, just like everyone else. JD let the silence stretch, watching Don carefully. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this? Or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don's jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly against his apron. And for the first time, JD saw it. That tiny flicker of doubt. Like maybe, just maybe, Don wasn't as sure about this as he wanted to be. But before Don could answer, the old man at the counter finally spoke. His voice was rough, worn, the voice of a man who had spent his whole life working with his hands. "Damn shame," he muttered, shaking his head, "when a man can't even get a burger." The diner cracked, not fully, not completely, but something shifted. The young guy in the booth let out a short laugh, almost like he couldn't believe what he had just heard. The waitress behind the counter, the one who had been standing there with her arms crossed, shifted slightly. Even Don exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. But JD, he stayed silent. because he knew this moment wasn't his. This wasn't about him proving a point. This was about something deeper. Don let out a slow breath. "I run a business," he said finally. "I don't pick fights. I don't want headlines." JD nodded. "I get that." Don hesitated. "People around here." He glanced at the customers, at the waitress, at the old man still stirring his coffee. "They don't like politicians. Don't trust them. And some of the things you've said, the things you've stood for, it doesn't sit right with folks." JD leaned back slightly. "Fair enough." Don hesitated again. Then finally he admitted it. "I don't know you personally," he muttered. JD nodded. "Then tell me this. If I was just some guy walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, would we even be having this conversation?" Silence. A real silence this time. Not tension, not discomfort, just realization. Because that was the question, wasn't it? How much of this was about who JD really was, and how much of it was about who people needed him to be? Don exhaled. He looked towards the kitchen where the cooks were still watching. Then he looked back at JD. "You really want to eat here?" JD shrugged. "I just wanted a burger." Another long pause. Then Don sighed, shaking his head. "You sit here and finish this conversation," he muttered. "And if, by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu." JD smirked. "Sounds like a deal." And just like that, the walls started to come down. The waitress behind the counter glanced toward Don. The old man at the counter finally picked up his fork again. Even the young guy in the booth, the one who had been so eager to prove a point, wasn't smirking anymore. Because this wasn't just a fight anymore, it was a conversation. And in a time when everyone is so quick to pick sides, to divide, to assume, a real conversation? That was something worth paying attention to. Have you ever been in a conversation that started as an argument but turned into something real? Have you ever judged someone only to realize you might have been wrong? And more importantly, how often do you give people the chance to prove you wrong? Because that's what this was about. Not about being right, not about winning, but about being willing to listen. So tell me, when was the last time you really listened? The tension in the diner hadn't disappeared. Not completely, but it had changed. It wasn't hostility anymore. It wasn't a standoff. It was something closer to curiosity. JD could feel it. The waitress behind the counter wasn't avoiding his gaze anymore. The young guy in the booth had dropped his smirk. Even Don, who had been the firmest in his stance, was now standing a little less rigidly, because something had shifted. This wasn't just about a meal anymore. It was about what this moment meant. JD leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "All right," he said, voice calm. "Let's finish this conversation." Don exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face, as if he were trying to push away the weight of years of expectations. He sat down across from JD. His arms were still crossed. His expression was still unreadable. But he sat. And in a place like this, with people like this, that meant something. The diner had never been this quiet. Even those who had pretended not to care were now sneaking glances over their plates. Because they weren't just watching JD anymore. They were watching Don. They were waiting to see what he would do. And Don, he knew it too. "I'll be honest," he muttered, shaking his head. "I don't know if you're the guy people think you are. I don't know if you're really looking out for folks like us, or if you just know how to talk a good game." JD nodded. "Fair enough." Don studied him. "What I do know," he continued, "is that around here, people got long memories. They remember every promise made to them. Every time someone shook their hand, looked them in the eye, and said they'd do something, only to walk away and never come back." JD tapped a knuckle against the table. Then he said, "I don't blame them for that." Don huffed out a small, tired laugh. "That's the problem," he muttered. "Nobody ever does." And just like that, it was real. Because this This wasn't just about JD. This wasn't just about one senator, one meal, one small-town diner. This was about something bigger. This was about trust, the kind of trust that had been broken too many times before, and the kind of people who had stopped believing it could ever be repaired. From the counter, the old man in the work jacket finally spoke again. "I worked 35 years in a factory," he muttered, setting his coffee down with a soft thunk. JD turned toward him, listening. The man didn't look up. "I watched my neighbors lose their jobs," he continued. "Watched whole families pack up and leave because there wasn't anything left for them. Watched politicians show up, shake a few hands, tell us they understood, then drive back to wherever the hell they came from." JD met his gaze. "And do you think I'm one of those politicians?" The old man stared at him for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "I don't know." He pointed a calloused finger toward JD. "But I can tell you one thing." JD raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" The old man let out a slow breath. "You're the only one who stuck around to listen." The diner cracked again. Not a full break. Not an obvious shift. But something changed. The waitress behind the counter glanced toward Don. The two cooks in the kitchen exchanged looks. Even the young guy in the booth, the loudest critic in the room, had nothing to say. Because the old man was right. JD had stayed. He had listened. And no matter what anyone thought of him before he walked through that door, that meant something. JD let the silence settle, then turned back to Don. "So, what's it gonna be?" Don tapped his fingers on the table, looked toward the kitchen, exhaled again. Then, he stood. He didn't say anything at first, but he turned toward the counter. "Mary," he called toward the waitress. She straightened slightly. Don hesitated. Then, finally, "Get him a menu." The diner reacted. A ripple of surprise passed through the room. The young guy in the booth let out a scoff. But he didn't argue. The waitress, Mary, hesitated for only a second before reaching for a laminated menu and walking it over. She placed it on the table. JD took it with a small nod of thanks. "Appreciate it." Don shook his head, half in amusement, half in disbelief. "I still don't know if I like you." JD smiled, flipping open the menu. "That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me." Don let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. Then he turned towards the kitchen. "All right, boys, fire up the grill." And just like that, what started as a refusal became something else. Not a victory, not a loss. Something in between. Something worth remembering. The tension had faded. Not completely, but enough. Enough for the clinking of forks against plates to return. Enough for the low murmur of conversation to slowly rebuild itself. JD sat at the booth, menu in hand, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching. Watching Don. Watching the old man at the counter. Watching the young guy in the booth who still looked skeptical, but wasn't smirking anymore. Mary, the waitress, poured him a cup of coffee without a word. He nodded in thanks. She hesitated, then muttered, "We make it strong here." JD took a sip, raised an eyebrow. "I can tell." A few people chuckled. It wasn't much. But it was something. What happens when people stop talking at each other and actually start listening? In a world where everyone is ready to fight, what happens when you choose to stay? Not to argue, not to win, but to understand. Because maybe, just maybe, that's how real change starts. So tell me, have you ever stayed in a conversation that felt impossible? And if not, would you? The smell of grilled burgers filled the air. Plates clinked against countertops. The soft murmur of conversation slowly returned, like the diner was exhaling. JD sat at the booth, fingers resting on the laminated menu, but he wasn't really reading it. Instead, he was watching. Watching the way the energy in the room had shifted. The people who had been waiting for a fight now seemed uncertain. The ones who had written him off before he even spoke were rethinking things. Even Don, who had been the most resistant, wasn't looking at him like a politician anymore. Just a man sitting in a booth, waiting for a meal. The old man at the counter stirred his coffee, then spoke, his voice rough, low, but steady. "Still a damn shame when a man can't get a burger." JD smirked. "I think that's about to change." A moment later, Mary, the waitress who had hesitated before, set a plate down in front of him. A classic diner cheeseburger, hand-cut fries on the side. Simple, perfect. JD picked up the burger, took a bite. The room watched, a beat of silence. Then, he set the burger down, wiped his hands on a napkin, and with a perfectly straight face said, "Little dry." For half a second, the diner was dead still. Then, Don barked out a laugh, a real, genuine laugh. Mary shook her head. The old man at the counter let out a small chuckle. Even the young guy in the booth, the one who had been the loudest critic all night, smirked just slightly. And just like that, the tension was gone. Not completely, not forever, but enough. Enough for JD to take another bite. Enough for Don to shake his head, still grinning, and mutter, "You're a piece of work." JD nodded. "I've been told." The diner started to feel like a diner again. Coffee refills were poured, plates clattered against tables. People started talking again, not about JD, not about politics, but about life. It wasn't perfect. There were still people in that room who didn't trust him. People who would walk out and still hold the same beliefs they had when they walked in. But for one night, in one small town, in one little diner, a different kind of conversation had happened. And maybe, in a world where people are always looking for a reason to fight, that was enough. Now, I want to ask you something. How many moments like this have we lost? How many times have we written someone off before they ever got the chance to speak? How many times have we chosen division over understanding? Not because we had to, but because it was easier? Because here's the truth. It's easy to fight. It's easy to leave. It's easy to decide that someone is one thing and one thing only. But what's hard? Staying, listening, having the kind of conversation that doesn't have a winner or a loser. Just two people trying to see each other as human beings. So I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment like this? A moment where you had to decide between walking away and staying to listen? Did it change anything? And more importantly, would you do it again? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because these are the stories that matter. And if you found this one worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because in a world that feels more divided than ever, there's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.